just take a moment to allow your eyes to close and allow yourself to begin to relax. And as you begin to relax, I'm just going to tell this sleep meditation in the background. And while I tell this sleep meditation, I don't know whether you'll drift asleep faster to the sound of my voice or to the spaces between my words. And while you begin to drift asleep, I'm just going to tell this story about a man in a cabin in the woods. And this man has got his TV on in the corner of the cabin. He's got his fire in the fireplace, crackling away. He's got a reading chair near that fire where he can keep warm, sit down and read. And on the floor in front of the fire is a cat. And that cat is just enjoying drifting, floating asleep, with the warmth of that fire on their side, just warming their fur. While the man is in the kitchen area, and he's just cooking himself some food. He's doing a bit of baking. And he's got his cookbook out and he's trying to follow the recipe. And all over the work surface and caked through the cookbook is flour, and some damp flour sticking to the pages, where he's got his dirty fingers into that book while he's trying to read it, kneading flour, rolling the flour out, and trying to make a cake. And in the background the oven dings to let him know that it's reached the correct temperature. He slides the cake into the oven, sets a timer, washes his hands, looks at the mess on the kitchen work surface, and decides that he's going to just take a brief break. He can clean that up in a little bit. And he goes and sits down in that chair, picks the book up from beside him, and begins to read. And as he reads, so he begins to relax. After the stress of trying to bake a cake, and a part of his mind keeps saying that he should just have gone and bought one, that it's a lot of effort to go to when you can buy one for cheaper than all the ingredients cost. And another voice in his mind says that he really wanted to make this cake. He's not really very good at baking, but he wanted to really give it a go. To see something that, even if it didn't turn out perfect, he put everything together, and it's his, it's what he made, and there'll be a certain charm to it, rather than something that looks perfect, that has probably been made by machines. And this conversation goes on in his mind, between drawing his attention to sentences in the book. And as he finishes one sentence, so another begins, and he reads that, until he gets to the end of a chapter, to the end of the last sentence, and turns the page, and kind of drifts in his mind to the sounds around him before he begins reading again. to hearing the sound of snow outside, where as the breeze blows, occasionally there'll be slightly stronger gusts of wind, and it'll sound like mice are throwing tiny snowballs at the glass, almost like mice are outside, trying to get attention to ask to come in. And he knows that as he begins to think like that, a smile begins to come to his face, where he feels perhaps he's reading too many of these books, giving animals personalities and turning them almost into human-like characters, because he knows there are no mice out there standing in the snow, throwing tiny snowballs at his window. He knows it's just the wind, blowing the large snowflakes that are falling down at the glass. And then as the wind relaxes, so everything outside goes quiet again. And occasionally the fire will flicker and dance as some wind manages to blow down the chimney and catch that flame slightly. And the logs will crackle and pop. And the cat seems totally unfazed by all this. And the man looks at how long is left before the cake is done. And he sees that there isn't that long left now, perhaps just 10 minutes. But no sooner has he looked at the time and the oven turns itself off, along with the lights. And he looks up at the light as if somehow that would do something, and notices that there's obviously been a power cut. And occasionally in this remote location, in this cabin, in the woods, in the middle of nowhere, snow will gather on the lines and will manage to either short out a line and sometimes even get so heavy and turn very icy and bring lines down. And so he knows that he might have to wait a while. And he feels partly irritated that his cake isn't finished yet. And he leaves it in the oven and leaves the oven closed for now, feeling that perhaps the oven will still be very warm. Maybe it'll take a bit longer, but perhaps it'll totally cook. So he leaves that in the oven for now. He goes and gets some candles. And he's so used to his property, he can just walk around in the dark and feel very comfortable. And it isn't entirely dark. There's the glow from the fire. And he carefully walks around where the cat is resting on the mat, aware that he can't really notice the cat in the dark. So he does that as carefully, gently as he can. Heads over, gets some candles, turns the candles on, places them on the sides. Is surprised that the batteries in some of those candles are still working. And he thinks back to his childhood, to days when, where he grew up, lights would sometimes go out, and in those days you'd have to go and get wax candles, and the feel of those candles, and you'd have to find a lighter or some matches, and you'd worry about those flames being around the house. But what if a candle fell over? And how much more convenient, at least short-term, candles with batteries are. And that nowadays they come flickering, just like real candles, even though they're just battery-powered. And so, once he's turned on a bunch of candles around the room, he heads back to the chair, and he finds that it's too dark to be able to read any more of his book. So he just sits there for a little while, listening and relaxing, hearing the gentle sound of the snow gradually building up on the windowsill outside the windows. He can see the faintest glimmer of light coming in through the windows, knowing that there's obviously a bit of light outside, reflecting off clouds, maybe some moonlight managing to break through and bounce around outside on the snow, the white clouds. And so he just gazes out towards the window. And while resting there, he begins to notice tiny little points of light. And he watches and allows his eyes to focus beyond the window on those tiny points of light, and realizes that they're like tiny fireflies darting around, almost like fighter jets, sometimes flying in formation, other times darting at each other and spinning around, up high and then coming down low, sometimes just suddenly dropping and then stopping and almost hovering. Sometimes the light would go out for a moment and then come back on. And he watched with interest. And as he watched with interest, so he could begin to really smell that cake. And he felt that maybe that cake is beginning to cook through fully. And he can't tell quite how long has passed. And he heads to the oven, he fills the oven, he feels the warmth of that oven. He decides to leave it just a little bit longer before checking on the cake. He doesn't know exactly when the lights will turn on, when the electric will come back on, or whether it'll even stay off all night long. And he thinks to himself how he'll know whether this cake is cooked when he can't see. So he grabs a knife from a kitchen drawer. He feels the blade of the knife with his fingertips to get an idea of what the knife feels like. He then goes to the oven, takes the cake out of the oven, carefully places it down on the side, and he can feel, when he moves his hand near the cake, the warmth given off by the cake. And he rests the knife gently on top of that cake. He hears the slight tap as the knife strikes that crust on the surface. He applies the slightest of pressure and feels the knife pass through the top of the cake until he hears it thud at the bottom of the tin. He leaves it there just for a moment. He feels a slight tower of steam coming up from the hole created by the knife. He pulls that knife back out. And using his thumb and forefinger, he touches the blade of the knife again. And it feels dry and warm. And so he knows that cake is done. And he covers the cake, goes and sits back down in the seat, and as he does, the cat awakens, jumps up on his lap, purrs, turns around on his lap, as if just changing position to drop back asleep, and falls asleep on his lap. And he strokes that cat gently, while the cat drifts back asleep. And while he's sitting in the dark, with only the sound of the crackling fire, the dancing of the firelight, the light from those candles, the slight glow from outside the windows, he appreciates the peace, the calmness of the environment. And that without anything to judge time by, he realizes he's unable to tell whether an hour has passed, or 2 hours, or 3 hours. That the time just almost seems timeless. All he's aware is that it still looks like night time outside. Still a long way from the dawn. And he's not feeling tired. So he's aware that, although he's deeply relaxed, it probably isn't bedtime just yet. And he closes his eyes and begins to just drift into a meditation. Decides to drift into a reverie, where he focuses his attention on the sounds he can hear. He thinks to himself, I can hear the crackling fire. I can hear the purring cat. I can hear the faintest sounds of the snowdrops, of those snowflakes on the window. I can hear the distant occasional rustling of the branches of the trees. I can hear the occasional sound from the oven as the oven is cooling down. He then focuses on things that he can see, and he opens his eyes and holds his gaze out towards the window and lets his eyes defocus. He thinks to himself, I can see those fireflies. I can see the flickering candlelight. I can see the dancing light of the fire. I can see the window frame. I can see dancing shadows. And he closes his eyes again and thinks of some things that he can feel. He thinks to himself, I can feel the warmth of the fire. I can feel the purring, movement of the cat on my lap. I can feel my back against the chair. I can feel my feet resting on the floor. I can feel the air as I breathe in and out. And while he focuses on these things, so he notices the relaxation deepening. He notices his shoulders beginning to slump and relax further. He notices the voice in his mind quietening down and being focused on where he's focusing his attention. And he thinks to himself, I can smell that cake, and I can relax deeper. And as he thinks all this, so it's almost like everything around him is being turned down, like his senses are being turned down. And as those senses are being turned down, so the senses in his mind begin to turn up. He finds himself more absorbed in an internal reverie, where he stops being so aware of the cat on his lap, of his motionless body, begins to drift into that reverie, where he finds himself in a cabin that looks surprisingly like his own, on what looks like a warm summer's day. He finds himself standing up from the chair, walking to the door, leaving that cabin, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. Hearing sounds of frogs down by the lake, sounds of some birds of prey flying overhead, circling and catching up drafts, rising higher and higher. Feeling the breeze while he walks away from the cabin and heads towards the forest. And as he heads into this forest, so he notices how the atmosphere changes, almost like the air pressure changes as he walks into the forest. And he's aware that this is an unfamiliar forest, and yet something about it feels comforting and inviting. There's a certain softness to the sounds, to the feeling of each step that he takes, the way the sunlight dances through the canopy. And he walks deeper and deeper into this forest. And as he walks deeper into the forest, so he notices a red thread tied to a tree. And he sees that that thread seems to be tied from one tree to another, to another, to another. He decides to follow that thread and see where it leads. And at some points, there's a long distance between one tree and the next tree that the thread is tied around. And as he walks along, he lets that thread rest through the palm of his hand. And he can feel the feeling of that thread softly, almost tickling the underside of his hand while he walks, following the thread deeper into the forest. He notices that the thread takes a turn at one point down towards the ground, but it still seems taut, so he knows it goes somewhere. And he moves the leaves, the branches from that point, and notices how that thread seems to be heading down into some kind of a cave. And he has a mobile phone on him. And he turns on the torch on the phone and heads down into that cave. And in the cave, he finds a bear. And it's a large, friendly-looking bear. A bear with a red woolen jumper, with the bottom half of the jumper missing and the thread leading to the jumper. And he wonders whether the bear tied that thread to that first tree, or somehow got it caught on that first tree, and perhaps have been winding themselves through the woods to this hole in the ground. And this bear could be seen to be breathing so deeply, so comfortably, as they slept there in that red woolen jumper. And then another bear, a child-aged bear, poked its head up from behind that bear, climbed over the bear, and introduced itself. And the man was surprised. The bear could talk, and talked with a childlike voice. And the man introduced himself back. And the man sat down, and this child bear began talking to him. Began asking who he was, where he's from. Does he want to play a game? Does he want to go on a bear hunt? Does he want to play hide and seek? Does he want to play I Spy? What's his favourite childhood game? And the man tries to engage in this conversation, but feels uncomfortable around children, doesn't know quite what to say. And the man asks, do you know what happened to the other bear's jumper? And the bear responds, saying that that's his dad, and that he thought it'd be funny. He found a loose thread on his dad's jumper. He thought it'd be funny to tie it to a tree. And he wondered how long it would take his dad to notice. And he kept on saying to his dad, oh, can you go and pick that mushroom for me? Can you go and pick that off of that tree for me? Could you go and get that for me? And he said that Dad kept on going and doing these things, weaving himself through the trees, as his jumper was unravelling more and more. And the bear said he kept on wanting to snigger and laugh, and kept having to hold it back. wondering when his dad would notice. And then his dad got all the way back home and said it was time for bed. And he said he's not ready for bed yet. He wants to play. But he said his dad just lay down, closed his eyes, and fell asleep. And so he was sat there, twiddling his paws, wondering what he could do to amuse himself. And then the man had turned up. And he thought, maybe this man could amuse me. Maybe he'll play games with me. And that his dad doesn't seem to have noticed what's happened to his jumper yet. And so he hasn't had the fun of seeing his dad discover what's happened. And the man talks with the bear. And then the dad makes a few grumbling sounds. A few sounds almost like yawning and deep breathing. Before waking up and almost appearing a bit startled by seeing this human sat there. And then asks who he is and what he's doing there. And in his deep and friendly voice engages in conversation. And the man engages back in conversation. And then the dad bear tells the child to go outside and gather some berries that they can eat together. And the child goes off out. And the man asks the bear whether he's noticed what happened to his jumper. And the bear said, of course I noticed. I noticed when I saw him tying the loose thread to a tree. But I thought it'd be more fun to pretend that I didn't notice. And to have fun with his frustration of waiting for me to comment. And they engage in conversation until the child bear returns. And they sit and eat berries. And the whole time, the man is aware that this is all still part of a reverie. That although it all feels very real to him, he knows that in reality he sat in the dark, meditating, drifting in a reverie, with a power cut going on around him. With a cat resting on his lap. And the bear says, do you want to go out for a walk? I'll show you to a nearby place that my son really loves. And he takes the jumper off, tells his son what happened here. And the son responds with a snigger at what they've done. And he acts surprised. And the son seems to find this even more amusing. And he changes into a jacket before they head out and start walking through this forest. And they follow a line of trees that seems incredibly straight, almost like they were planted on purpose. And the bear explains that this path has been laid down and walked by many generations of bears, that anything that builds up in this path, they keep it clear, and so it means that although this seems like it was made on purpose, it's just a natural outcome of the same route being taken year after year after year. And they head down to a water's edge, and near this water's edge is the smoothest, flattest stone that this man had ever seen. It looked almost polished. And the bear said that for generations they've come down here and they've sat and just listened to nature. And generations of bears sitting on that stone have shaped what it has become. And out of the jacket pocket, the bear takes a coin. And the bear says, "Heads, you catch dinner. Tails, I'll catch dinner." And the bear flips the coin in the air, and the man watches as it spins. Then it lands and bounces on the stone. It spins around a few times. The bear places its paw over that coin, lifts its paw, and it heads. And the man thinks to himself, "I don't know how to catch dinner." And the bear says, "It's fine, you'll figure it out. We'll sit here and wait. You've got the river just running along there. I'm sure you'll be fine. Here, take this coin for good luck." The bear hands the man the coin. And as he takes the coin and goes to put it in his pocket, he notices that it's heads on both sides. And he sees the smirk on the child bear's face. He puts the coin in his pocket, heads to the river. He can hear the rushing water, where part of the river is fast and bubbly. Another part of the river is calm and smooth. And he wades out. He can feel the water above his knees. He bends his legs slightly. And he remains still and focused. And he can see fish swimming around, swimming towards the flow of the river, almost hovering in position. And he just remains stationary where he is, and he carefully lowers his hands down into the water. So his hands are in line with his shins. He then moves his hands ever so slightly closer and just holds position and breathes and focuses and relaxes and just patiently waits. And the bears on the shore just patiently wait. And after a long time, a fish swims through his legs, between his hands, and he manages to grab that fish and throw it over onto the shore. And he does this a couple more times, with patience. And the bears are happy to eat them as they are. But the father bear decides, for the sake of this person, it'll be fun to camp so near the edge of the river. The father bear puts together a fire, lights that campfire. The father bear, the child bear, and the man then sit around that campfire. The bear says they'll do the cooking. So they cook up the food. And as they eat, so the father bear and the man almost drift into a philosophical discussion about space, about time, about nature, about reality. About what animals think and feel, what animals can talk. And all the while the man is aware that this is still just their reverie, despite it feeling like many hours. In reality they bet that it's only been a short while, that the mind is incredible like that a long time can pass in a very short period of real world time, if you just allow yourself to be absorbed in that inner reality. And they'll have that fleeting thought, that connection to the reality they know is out there, before allowing themselves to place most of their focus on enjoying a meal with two bears. And after the meal, the man says that it's time for him to go, that he should find his way back, that there's a cabin just outside this forest, that's where he started his journey. And they all say goodbye. The man finds his way back to that cabin as night time is setting in. He walks into the cabin. He sees that it looks incredibly familiar, sits down on that seat. He has a drink of the drink beside him, and then decides to rest back and start reading a book. And as he starts reading that book, so he starts to experience the strangest of things. The book seems to be getting larger and larger in his hands. And as the book is getting larger in his hands, so the chair that he sat in seems to be getting larger and larger. And then he realizes that it's not that the book and the chair are getting larger and larger, it's that he is getting smaller and smaller. And while he's beginning to get smaller and smaller, so he notices little sparkles of light surrounding his body. and that somehow he's getting smaller and smaller, with his clothes also shrinking at the same rate that he's shrinking. Until he finds himself no larger than a matchbox, standing on what's now a chair, miles above the ground, where that ground looks so far down. He manages to climb over the edge of the chair, carefully climb himself down the material of the cushions on the chair, down to the chair leg, all the way down that chair leg to the floor. And from down here, he almost feels like he's in a land of giants, where he feels like he can run for ages and yet barely traverse any of the floor. And he wonders what's going on here, why his mind has decided to encourage him to have this experience. He assumed he would read and drink a drink resting in that chair, and that would almost be like a signal for him to revert back to the chair he's in reality, in his own cabin. But instead he seems to have gone deeper and deeper into the experience, transitioned to a whole new experience. And he sees a tiny door in a floorboard. He goes over to it. He lifts up that door and sees some steps. He follows those steps down and then climbs some steps the other side, opens a door above his head and finds himself outside. And he turns and looks back at the size of the cabin. And he's aware that out here now is night time, and the forest, the lake, everything looks as it did last time he was outside, except that it's night time. So he assumes he's in the same experience, just having a different experience within that same inner world. And he starts pushing his way through the grass that towers way over his head, heading down towards the lake edge. And down near that edge of the water, he can see moonlight glistening and dancing on what to him at this scale seem like large waves. But intellectually he knows these waves are actually quite small. They just seem large because of his perspective. And he has to keep convincing himself of that, and of making sure that he's safe where he needs to be. And then he notices a fern leaf floating by. He decides to climb onto that leaf. He has a stick in his hands, pushes off from the side, and just feels that it'd be an adventure to head out a little way, and it would be much quicker to be travelling on water than pushing through all that tall grass that's much higher than he is, or even walking on that mud, which is deep and sticky. But he's sure that his unconscious would only be giving him this experience if there was some meaning behind it, and so, as he always tells himself, he should go with the flow. And so that's exactly what he does, pushing away from the side, moving away far enough away from the shore that the waves don't keep pushing him back towards the shore, and then just allowing himself to go with the flow, to follow where the rhythms, the current of that water takes him. And as that water gradually moves him down and around the lake, with the leaf bobbing up and down, he just goes with the flow, relaxing back on the leaf, just occasionally pushing the water with the stick, just to make sure that he stays on track, but trusting that he'll end up where he's supposed to be. And as he travels along, so he begins to notice what look almost like orbs of light appearing and rising from the water. And they appear out of the water, almost ethereal, rising up into the air. Then after rising some distance, they seem to just vanish into thin air. And he tries really hard to follow with his eyes where these orbs are going, but each one just rises up and then vanishes. And he decides to steer himself a little closer to where most of the orbs seem to be coming from. But he can never quite seem to get there. And then after a while, the tide just seems to take him over to a certain point on the bank. And so he allows it to push him up onto the bank. He walks along that fern leaf, climbs up onto the bank, walks away from the water a little bit, where all of a sudden, out of the dark, he spies a badger. And at first he's a little startled, as this badger is enormous compared to him. But the badger reassures him, and he feels comfortable now talking with this badger. And he asks the badger about this strange land, about the talking bears. Now there's a talking badger. And he asks about the orbs rising from the lake. And the badger explains that one night, when the water has the right level of stillness and the moon transmits its silver twinkling glow at just the right angle, the fairies are born. They transition from underwater creatures, almost like tiny mermaids. They almost become balls of light, balls of energy. It's like a cocoon that surrounds them, and as they transform inside that cocoon, they become lighter and lighter, not only brighter and brighter, but physically lighter and lighter. They become lighter than the water, and then the light that surrounds them lifts them out of that water. They float up into the air until they reach a certain height where the air interacts with the light, and the light interacts with the night. And in an instant, the fairy bursts out of that light, and the light disappears from around them, and a fairy is born, and they fly up high into the sky, where they can spread their wings in the moonlight, and the silver glow of the moonlight fills the veins in their wings with a special kind of energy that allows them to fly, allows them magical abilities, and almost gives them a magical energy that's enhanced with the beating of those wings. And then they beat their wings high up in the sky, warming the wings, warming the fairies. And once they've done this, they head off down into the forest. And you can then find those fairies in the forest, where they can perform magic. They can help life grow in the forest. They help those that are lost and those that are trying to be found. And sometimes they help just by being the voice in the back of your mind, where they just come down beside you, hovering by your ear. And they can talk verbally, but they can also communicate sounding like speech through the beat of their wings, beating their wings in certain rhythmic patterns that move the air around, replicating speech sounds, almost like a deeper and lower voice. And so, between being able to communicate using their wings and communicate verbally, they're able to replicate almost any voice they feel will be helpful to you as an individual. And that most people just see the glow of the wings from the distance and assume that they're either silvery glowing butterflies flying in the sky, darting through flowers, darting through the leaves in the trees. Or they catch that glow at night in the distance as fairies dance and interact with each other, or just travelling from A to B, and they interpret it as fireflies. But those fairies are always there to help. And the badger explains that you're here and you think this is just a reverie. But this is actually a deeper reality you're discovering that relates to your own reality, not just this reality in your mind. It's all representative. And the man doesn't fully understand, but on some level is aware that they can see a connection between the layout of this world in their mind and the reality. And they just feel that perhaps their mind just wasn't very creative in this instance, in this reverie, in creating the world their reverie was going to be in. Sometimes they drift into a reverie, and it could be an alien planet. It could be in outer space in a spaceship. It could even be floating in outer space, as if they're some kind of Superman able to fly in space without the need for any equipment. Or perhaps they're swimming underwater with dolphins, or with humpback whales. They usually find these reveries as so creative that they wondered why this world seemed so familiar and similar to their normal world where they've drifted into the reverie in. And then they ask how they're going to get back to their cabin. And the badger says that they can't really help themselves because they've got other things they need to be doing. But the frog can help. So they head to the frog, and the frog says, I can take you back to the cabin. Just jump on my back. And so the man jumps on the frog's back, and that frog begins to jump, and it leaps all the way back to that cabin. And the man holds on tight as the frog seems to bound its way across the grass until he can see the cabin. As he gets closer to the cabin, so he notices something strange occurring. That the weather near the cabin starts to change with each hop. That it goes from a summer's evening to him noticing snow around that cabin beginning to form, and realizing that it's almost as if that cabin and this reality are merging back together, as if he's beginning to get closer to his normal reality, beginning to drift out of this reverie. And as he closes in on the cabin, so he sees 3 mice stood outside that cabin, throwing tiny snowballs up at the window. And he watches in amusement as they do that, before watching those mice scurry off when he's near to them. And the frog arrives at the door, and with the size that he is, he dismounts off the frog. The frog says goodbye and heads off again. And he's able to just duck down a little bit and squeeze under the door. He squeezes himself under that door into the cabin. And as he does, he notices this cabin is dark, only lit with those electric candles, and the fire, and the moonlight shining in the windows. And he can see himself resting in the chair. And he heads over towards himself, and as he does, so he begins to get larger and larger, until he's his normal size. And he walks to where he is. And he feels this sense of being somehow ethereal, somehow not entirely physical. And so he carefully backs himself up into himself, lines his feet up with the feet of himself sat in that chair, then carefully sits himself down into himself in that chair. And then as himself in that chair, he has this sense that that's what he's just done. As he feels the warmth of the fire on his face, he hears the slight whistling of wind outside, the gentle tap of snow on the window panes. He carefully moves his shoulders and opens his eyes, realizes it's still very dark. He still has no idea of exactly how long has passed. And the cat's still asleep on his lap. And he carefully takes that cat off his lap places it down in front of the fire again. He walks over to one of the windows, rests his hand on the window and can feel that coolness passing through the window pane into the palm of his hand. He can feel the coolness from outside passing through the window onto his face, as his face is near to that window. And he notices some flashes of light off in the distance. And notices a period of silence before hearing the low, gentle rumble of thunder. And realizes that there's a distant thunderstorm within this snow. And he's heard about these thunder snowstorms before, although he's never experienced one himself. And he keeps gazing out that window at the distant flashes of light in the sky, illuminating the clouds, followed by that low rumble of thunder in the distance. And then after a while, his lights turn themselves on. He hears everything resetting and turning on after the power cut. The cat pops its head up with the sudden light before closing its eyes again and drifting back asleep. The man sees that it's now beginning to get very late, and that he should head to bed. So no sooner has he finished meditating and relaxing, and the lights have only just come on, and he decides to turn it all off again. He makes sure the cake is covered and looks forward to eating some of that tomorrow. He makes sure that the fire is just embers and is perfectly safe. Just to have the slightest warmth in the cabin while he sleeps. And he heads off to bed. And as he drifts and floats asleep in bed, so he recalls his reverie. He tries to work out its meaning of both parts of that reverie, of the encounter with the bears, of the encounter with that badger, and other aspects of that reverie. He knows that when he has reveries that are automatic, where he's just going along with that reverie, enjoying where it takes him, just going with the flow, he knows that it's his unconscious mind teaching him something, updating his mind with new ways of being, new ways of responding, things that he wants to work on, that maybe he doesn't consciously know the answers for. But he finds himself trying to work it out anyway, as he drifts and floats asleep, and while he drifts and floats into a dream, so he can still occasionally hear that slight rumble of thunder in the distance. He's aware the storm isn't getting any closer, but he notices that the snow begins to transition firstly into sleet and then into rain, and he finds while lying in a warm, comfortable bed with the sound of rain on the window, that distant, gentle, deep rumble of thunder. That something about that just helps him drift even deeper and feel even more relaxed in the experience of falling asleep. And he's curious about the fairies, whether there's more to the fairies, more to the experience than he realized. He remembers seeing what he thought looked like fireflies before he drifted into his reverie, and wonders whether they were fireflies, or whether his mind is aware that fairies are real out there somewhere, and that magic perhaps does exist, and isn't just something in stories and in your mind, or whether maybe he reads too many books and sometimes prefers to drift in those inner stories. And while he drifts asleep, so he finds himself walking through a land where his mind interprets the thunder in the distance as being a volcano he can see off in the distance, murmuring gently, just rumbling away, with the occasional puff of smoke and spitting of lava. And he looks around this dreamland he's drifting into. He sees a raven in a tree, just watching over him, making sure he's safe and well. And then he sees a green fairy fly down in front of him, and he notices her piercing green eyes, and the way that silver sparkles seem to emanate from the fairy's wings as they move so fast. The wings themselves almost just look like a blur. But every movement, every slight dart from one location to another leaves a small trail of silver sparkles that gradually fade. And the fairy talks with their voice and their wings, almost like a united voice that passes into his mind, into his body, and communicates with him a connection between his inner world and the outer world, and that he should believe in magic. And as he thinks about the idea of believing in magic, a bear hands him their leather jacket. He climbs on a motorbike, and while thinking of believing in magic and drifting deeper and deeper asleep, knowing he'll awaken in the morning, feeling so refreshed and revitalized and full of energy, having made some inner changes, he decides to go on an adventure, go on a journey to that volcano, a journey of deep inner discovery, unsure what this journey will entail. And as he cycles off on that motorbike, he drifts deeper and deeper into the most peaceful, most comfortable sleep